Pleasure. A very warm welcome to all of you for joining today's webinar. My name is Eva Zabe. I'm the Executive Director of Business for Nature, and I'm really excited to have this opportunity to share with you Business for Nature's position on Target 15, which is the business action key target in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So today, to briefly introduce, we have a range of real experts and speakers providing so much experience to share to really bring to life this Target 15. Business for Nature is a global coalition of leading business organizations around the world. And together, our aim is to demonstrate business leadership and momentum to drive policy ambition on nature. We know that companies are already taking action in many ways to reverse nature loss. We know also that that is not enough, and we need to quickly scale and speed up business action through the very critical lever of policy ambition, which will drive even more business action. We can see how Target 15 and the Global Biodiversity Framework as a whole is already starting to catalyze and prepare companies to drive even more action within their supply chains and full value chains. To get right into it, because we have a packed agenda, which hopefully will be very helpful for all of you on the line. Our priorities going into Nairobi, into the open-ended working group 4, are threefold. We're focusing on Target 15, on the mission, and on Target 18. You can read our full updated position, fresh off the press, building on further input that we have received from companies coming out of the Geneva meetings. On Target 15, which is the primary focus for today's webinar, we are calling for mandatory requirements to assess and disclose impacts and dependencies. We want to make sure we keep a numerical target to reduce negative impacts by 50% at least. And we need to look beyond just direct operations, but the full value chain. And just to highlight briefly on the other two priorities, on the mission, we're very encouraged to see the consensus that was appearing in the Geneva meetings on the need to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and achieve a nature positive world by 2030. The mission is essential. It provides the finish line that we can all race towards, but without a clear finish line, there will be no race. And businesses and financial institutions are keen to be part of that journey and that race. And then finally, Target 18 on subsidies. Now, we need to make sure that we keep the ambition in Target 18 to reform incentives, including both redirecting and eliminating environmentally harmful subsidies. We need to keep the numerical figure. Once again, it provides more clarity, and we need to keep the new reference on positive incentives. So with that, and I would like to just welcome everyone who's just joined once again. We would like to welcome you to provide comments and ask questions in the chat function. We'll try to address as many of these as possible on the call right now, but if we're not able to, we will follow up afterwards. So our first speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce Martin Locke from the Capitals Coalition, who will get into a little bit more detail on Target 15 and what we're calling for. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you joining this call at this moment. So let's dive into Target 15 a little bit more. Mandatory requirements. So business are asking to adopt in the Target 15 mandatory requirements for business and financial institutions. And why that's necessary and why our business is calling for this. Business needs a global playing field that ensures fair competition. And also a mandatory requirement will help to accelerate the standardization that is already underway, but needs to go much faster than it goes currently. Also, mandatory requirements will help business to increase the accountability and transparency, engage investors, and also empowers consumers, as you see on the slide. What I would like to stress also is many businesses really call for these mandatory requirements. We just concluded a business survey with SMEs as well as corporates across the globe, and an astonishing 91% of them, 9 out of 10, agree that mandatory requirements are needed to really speed up their inputs and disclosure on assessments and disclosure and assessment of impacts and dependencies on natural capital. Next slide, please. So it's not only needed to have mandatory requirements, also the target needs to be very specific, that we have to reduce negative impacts by at least 50%. Such a numerical target is important because business need a clear and measurable time-bound goal and sense of urgency. The science is clear. The current production and consumption patterns are beyond planetary boundaries. And in order to really accelerate implementation, what parties need to do, what governments need to do is help business to break down this target at the national level, to prioritize categories of impacts and to identify specific contributions by sector. So this is a target, you could say, for business, but it's not business that can do it alone. Governments and business need to collaborate on this. And an important role for government also is to support the use of existing tools like the science-based targets or the Tnfd that are in development and that are already tested by many businesses around the globe. Next slide, please. So what also is a key element for business in relation to Target 15 is to act across operations and value chains. And I mean, it's good if businesses act for their own operations, their plants, their factories, but if they do not include the value chains, they will not do enough. So that's why we welcome the addition of across operations and value chains in the first part of the target. This is also an important element because the collaboration across value chains will stimulate larger companies to work to support with SMEs to address their impacts, which is a key element. If this target only focuses on the large companies, it will leave out the majority of the businesses across the globe. And of course, SMEs need an approach that is fitted for them in their specific context. But large companies could really help to deliver this. And that's why an approach towards the whole of the value chain really is a key element. So with this, I would like to thank you, and back to you, Eva, for the follow of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Martin. And so the proposal that Business for Nature is putting forward for Target 15 is indeed ambitious. And I can imagine a number of you are asking, but how will business and financial institutions be actually able to implement this in practice? The reality is that it's indeed a complex task, but we cannot be paralyzed by the complexity. Science is clear. We need to act now. We need to act at scale and at speed. And the good news is that tools, methodologies, and frameworks are already in place to support and assist businesses to act now, making Target 15 implementable. We also know that there are companies that are already doing this and can leverage the global biodiversity framework to scale and speed up and to level the playing field that Martin was talking about. So now let's hear from some of our speakers in this first part, which is about how can we implement Target 15 across value chains. We're going to hear from two speakers. So Nadine Mccormick, who's the nature manager at WBCSD, and Syamala Gowri, manager sustainability at Jayanti Herbs and Spices. Just before the webinar, Thomas Lingard, who's the global sustainability director at Unilever, just said that he was feeling unwell, so we wish him well, and I will share some of the key messages from Unilever on his behalf. But to start with, I'm going to hand over to Nadine Mccormick from WBCSD, who's going to give us an overview of the actions that business can take now to contribute to the implementation of Target 15. So Nadine, over to you. What can businesses do now to already start helping with the implementation of Target 15? Over to you, Nadine.
Cool. Thank you so much, Eva. Really happy to be here today. And I think the good news is, yeah, there is so much that business can already do to get started. I should also say that WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, we fully support this target. As most people on the call will know, we're a CEO-led coalition of more than 200 member companies, acting to get the transformations needed to get to a more sustainable future. And we recently introduced membership criteria for our members, one of which is on nature. And we talk about setting ambitious science-informed goals to halt and reverse the loss of nature and disclose on progress made in those goals. And so actually you can see already it's a precursor for the science-based targets on nature, as well as a task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which are both to be coming up later. And the framing of it nicely aligns with Target 15 as well. So really the leading 200 companies on sustainability at WBCSD, we support this target. As you can see, leading companies actually are already taking action on this. And there's a range of tools that have been developed over the last 10, 20 years in this space. Now, I know some of our member companies, they come to me and they're like, I don't understand all these acronyms, this acronym soup, or even worse, the acronym tsunami. So we've mentioned two of the important ones already, SBTN and Tnfd, but there's a whole other range that have been developed. And I think what's interesting is this slide that we're showing here is a relatively new slide, but it came from this pressure or this very human need to understand how these different initiatives and tools and approaches out there, are they saying the same thing? Are they saying contradictory things? Aren't they? Isn't there an overlap? It's creating confusion. And I think the good news is with this slide, what we've been able to distill, a group of organizations that are working with business, is we've distilled this high level logic, these high level actions that regardless of the tools that you look at, all of them will be looking at how a company can help assess their main impacts and dependencies, prioritize those, measure and value those, interpret into decision making and disclosing on that, in committing, identifying those science-based targets, again, initially starting with the priority ones to embed not just within the company, but the value chains and beyond, and disclose on that, and looking at transforming the systems. This is not just taking actions at a site level, which many companies are familiar with, maybe net positive impact, but really looking to transform the system and actions at all of these scales and disclosing on that. And really, when you think about those initiatives that we're going to speak about later as well, they dock into one of those areas. And so there's a range of other initiatives out there. I could go into them, but we've got some great documentation we've pulled together through the Business for Nature website. And here you can see some of those acronyms where they come in. I think another factor, if we could do, the next iteration of this would be looking at maturity levels. And so maybe not all companies are ready right now to set science-based targets for nature, but there's a range of initiatives to get them going on their journey on nature. But the encouraging news is this is the right place to start. Mandatory disclosures to just understand impacts and dependencies are important to get a company going. Once they recognize that, then the rest will follow. But the first barrier is like, well, I don't see my impacts and dependencies. So making it mandatory, making them aware, gets them more quickly on their journey to start contributing to a nature positive future. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks so much, Nadine. So we're getting that confidence. The convergence is here, and now we are ripe for the translation into, the time is ripe for the translation into the Global Biodiversity Framework. Thanks, Nadine. So moving on to what Thomas from Unilever was going to share. So very briefly, for those who aren't aware, Unilever made a commitment last year in 2021 to help protect and regenerate 1.5 million hectares of land, forests, and oceans by 2030. And they calculated this by looking at where the company could have the most impact within their extended value chain. It also builds on work that they had already carried out on protecting and regenerating nature. So it also fits right in their strategy. And just a few examples that Thomas was going to share. One is on agroforestry in Côte d'Ivoire, where Magnum, who you may know, Unilever's largest ice cream brand, partnered with WWF and IDH to run a forest restoration program, and it will replant around 465,000 native trees in the Cavally region, which is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world. Another example of the landscape work in Indonesia and Malaysia, Unilever has 5 place-based partnerships where they've been focusing on landscapes and jurisdictions for sourcing programs that include conservation and restoration interventions. And then also I would just like to, there's more information on their website, I should say, around their work with WWF in Sabah in Malaysia as well. But then finally, just on the regenerative agriculture in North America and Europe. So this is where Unilever wants to regenerate nature. It will drive the uptake of regenerative agricultural practices and contribute to the restoration of degraded landscapes. So it's not only about doing more good, it's also making sure that we are restoring degraded landscapes, particularly supporting programs that protect natural ecosystems. They're focused very much also on cover crops and soil health for soy farmers in Iowa in the US. So they have, just to wrap up, 5 key principles for regenerative agriculture, which are regenerating soils, protecting water, increasing biodiversity, developing climate solutions, and improving farmer livelihoods. So with that, I'd now like to turn to Syamala Gowri, who's the manager of sustainability at Jayanti Herbs and Spices. So Syamala, Jayanti has set itself a target to have 50% of sustainable sourcing materials by 2030. Could you share with us, please, how you're implementing this target? Thanks so much. Over to you, Syamala.
Hi, Eva. Thank you. So Jayanti has a wide focus on sustainability, because it's very closely related to what Jayanti does, across its value chain. And the example that I am presenting here is something that's very core to our production systems, where we are trying to have a direct connect with the farmers and also ensure, because this is the start of our entire value chain journey. And it is very important that from here, we take forward the target at multiple ways by multiple interventions. So we have targeted that by 2030, 50% of the total produce is sustainably sourced. It's quite, it may look quite ambitious, but what we have learned with our experience, we had a milestone in 2022 that at least 20% we should achieve, but we have achieved up to 30%. And it has been only possible because we have understood the area and we have designed area-based programs that have supported us to achieve this target. And in the similar manner, we have multiple other goals and targets. Overall, we aim at improving our performance 10% year on year. And why UN SDG? If the idea is, it gives us, for any businesses, the major challenge is we do make targets, we do have action plan, but how do we monitor? So UN SDG 2031 agenda is one such tool for us, which gives us an measurable, performance indicator based on which. And going forward, we are looking forward that the post 2020 targets also will provide us the similar aspect. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Syamala. So message here is also that we already have the SDG framework and 2030 action plan. So the action agenda, we can build on that. There's already momentum underway in companies to start setting these targets. So thank you so much. We will continue to move on, but please, as a reminder, feel free to drop any comments or ask any questions in the chat function, and we will come to that. So the second part of this webinar, we're speeding through to give you all the information we hope that's helpful for all of you, is really on why mandatory requirements are necessary, as Martin and the other speakers started to outline here. So to begin with, we have two key speakers, Tony Goldner, who's the Executive Director of the Tnfd, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and also Isabel Tome Esteban, who's the Head of Biodiversity at Iberdrola. So to begin with you, Tony, you know, we heard from Martin that there's a strong support from business for such mandatory requirements, as they're essential to level the playing field, to demonstrate the urgency and to generate large-scale actions that are very meaningful. We also need to increase the accountability and the transparency. We need to empower the consumer in having the information that they need, as well as investors. So the question is, would businesses and financial institutions have the right tool and framework to implement such requirements? I know that Tnfd is a market-led initiative that builds a voluntary reporting framework. And just as the TCFD did on climate, your objective is to build a framework that is fit for purpose and globally relevant to assist businesses and financial institutions of all shapes and sizes to disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. So Tony, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us how the Tnfd will support business and government on the disclosure element? Over to you.
Thanks very much, Eva, and great to be here with you. I can also see my friend and task force member Renata on the call from Holcim. So great to see you, Renata. So Eva, as you pointed out, the TCFD is underway with building a risk management and disclosure framework for nature-related risks. Important to re-emphasize your opening comment that we are market-led. We are building a framework for the market, essentially by the market. So while the Tnfd is funded by government and philanthropic funding, all of the task force members are from the private sector. And our focus is also on voluntary adoption. So we are taking the same pathway as TCFD. But of course, there is a lot of interest from governments and regulators in what we're doing. And ultimately, that may lead to mandatory disclosure. Our focus right now is designing, as you said, a framework that is fit for purpose, that's scalable, and ultimately a framework that will provide comparable, high-quality, decision-useful information for both company executives and investors. And of course, that's not an easy task. Nature is a lot more complicated than climate. You know, on the TCFD and the climate side, we had half a dozen gases that are the focus of attention. On nature, we are looking at everything to do with terrestrial realms, ocean realms, and freshwater realms. And so there's just a huge, obviously huge number of aspects of nature and its health and resilience that we need to be factoring in, as well as the impacts that business have on those. I would also say that one of the things that's coming through in the conversations in the last 8 months since the task force has been started is this growing awareness of business forming a much deeper view of their dependencies on nature, not just their impact on nature. And in our view, a stronger focus on dependencies is welcome, because dependencies connect to impacts and dependencies connect to risk to enterprise value. So whether or not a business is focused on minimizing its impact on the environment because of a social sense of social responsibility, or whether they're interested in enterprise value and impact on enterprise value, the connection between dependencies and impacts really brings that together. And in some sense, we're seeing an increasing shift in the mindset. And so what are we doing at the Tnfd to help inform this desire or this need for comparable market information? I've got up here on this slide a sense of what's inside the Tnfd risk management and disclosure framework that's coming together. So at its foundation is a set of core concepts and definitions, and we've been very much building on the approach from the Capitals Coalition and the Natural Capital Protocol, so taking a natural capital view of the world. We are working really hard right now on putting out some guidance coming up at the end of June around our approach to metrics and targets, and this will be very aligned with the approach I think that SBTN and many others have been taking to thinking about how we're going to measure impacts on nature and how we're going to improve measurement around dependency on nature. Because there's typically been a much stronger focus on the impact side and less on the dependency side, and we need to sort of make those two aspects as robust as each other. Sitting on top of the metrics will be guidance around how companies can actually do this within their enterprise or their investment portfolio. And again, there's a lot of guidance from SBTN, Capitals Coalition, and many others, and we are aligning the guidance we will be providing with those others so that there's a consistent sense of how do we actually go about doing this. Once we have the numbers, once we have the data, assuming we can solve those problems, which is not insurmountable in itself, what do we actually do? What do I ask my team to do in the risk team or in our sustainability team? What does that process look like? So we are working with others to develop that guidance, and ultimately that will lead to a set of disclosure requirements about what companies would be expected to provide to investors to provide that comparable decision useful information. So that's the approach we're taking. I'm very happy to take some comments and questions, but we are very much trying to build a framework that works both for the big end of town, but for smaller and medium-sized enterprises. And to the point that was made by Syamala before, it's really all about location. And I was delighted to hear that Jayanti and others are very much now thinking about localized impacts, localized dependencies, and what they can do in a local context to move to more sustainable supply chains and sustainable business operations. So location is really important. And we will also be trying to make this framework useful to small and medium-sized enterprises, because ultimately really big global corporations are going to want to move this up their supply chain and have their suppliers able to do the same thing. So we really do need a framework that works for businesses of all shapes and sizes. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks so much, Tony. Also emphasizing here the point that disclosure is not the end itself, it's a means to help make better informed decisions, and therefore also that deeper understanding of dependencies, of local context-driven impacts and dependencies, and the link with enterprise risk management really brings that home. And so I would invite everyone to also see the draft framework that is already open for consultation and for all of you to review. So thanks. It's really reassuring that this is going to be feasible. Despite the complexity, it is on its way. There's already a strong foundation. And the question therefore then is, well, you know, what are businesses already doing now? And I'm going to be turning to Isabel Tome, who's the head of biodiversity at Iberdrola, a global energy company based in Spain. As Martin mentioned earlier, when we carried out our business survey, 91% of business respondents said that they were in favor of mandatory requirement to assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. Iberdrola was one of them. Your company is already assessing and disclosing. Can you please briefly tell us, Isabel, why you're already doing so, but then also what mandatory requirements would change for you? So please, over to you, Isabel. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eva, and all for this webinar. At Iberdrola, we support the recommendations made by Business for Nature in Target 15. And as you said, Eva, we have been voluntarily disclosing our management approach and our relationship with nature for the last 18 years. As you can see there, we have been producing sustainability reports since 2004. 2007, we were producing our first biodiversity report. 2008, our carbon footprint, and 2016, our first corporate environmental footprint. So we have been disclosing and with transparency our performance. And we are disclosing to allow the stakeholders to see the comparing performance and engage with investors. And transparency is part of our governance and sustainability system, and is one of our policy commitments. In the second question, to answer that, as well as for climate and biodiversity is a bit more complex to measure. We truly believe that having a common language on biodiversity with investors, shareholders, and society has never been so important. So that's why we need from governments the clear rules and standards for better transparency and comparability. And we have been used several frameworks along the years and methodologies, and we know that it can be costly and time resources, and biodiversity is a complex issue. That's why we need a robust and stable guiding principles to assess and disclose impact on biodiversity. And they need to be, these rules should consider materiality for ourselves, and they need to be simple. We need to think this is a journey, it's a complex issue, and there's not the perfect be on the way of good. So, but the more important thing, I think they need the KPIs that are meaningful for stakeholders and for companies. That this, as you said, not just for disclosure, just they are actually useful. And we need support from the administrations with sound environmental databases to help us to assess and value more efficiently our impacts and dependencies. And on this journey, we believe that the participation of different stakeholders through consultation process is essential on developing these regulations.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I mean, 2007 first biodiversity report, that seems to me it must have been one of the first companies to ever publish a biodiversity report. And I was just looking at your title, Head of Biodiversity. I mean, how many companies increasingly, in fact, have positions of leadership for biodiversity and nature? So thank you so much. I think what I really took from your presentation is also this need for that shared language, the need for clear rules, meaningful KPIs, and the headline messages that, well, companies need to compete on their environmental and social performance, not on the methodologies to really drive that progress at scale and at speed. Thanks, Isabel. So now we're going to move on to the final and third part of this webinar, which is how do we measure success? You know, we've heard from leading businesses on how an ambitious target 15 can be implemented and why mandatory requirements are important and a really important element to keep in this target. So now this part of the webinar is really about how do we measure success, which is an essential part to consider if we want to have targets that are smart and realistic. So our next speaker, we have 3 speakers in this section. So Oscar Sabag from the Science Based Targets Network. We have Renata Polini, Head of Nature at Holcim, another great title for that role. And then Sharon Brooks, who's the Principal Business and Biodiversity Specialist at UNEP WCMC. So first, moving to Oscar, who's the Science Translation Lead, another great title at the Science Based Targets for Nature Network. SBTN, for those who are not aware, but hopefully you are, is developing a framework to enable companies to define a clear and science-based pathway to ensure that they're doing enough across their value chains to address their impacts on nature and to help make sure we can measure progress. So Oscar, can you please tell us how SBTN can support business implementation of Target 15 by assessing, measuring, and managing their impacts? Over to you, Oscar.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the introduction and for the clear messages from all the previous speakers. So at the Science Based Targets Network, as Eva mentioned, our mandate is to translate global goals into individual company and city targets so that these stakeholders can contribute to net zero, nature positive, and equitable futures for everyone. Businesses that adopt science-based targets will be able to indeed assess, measure, and reduce their impacts on nature using the guidance and tools that we are producing. We use a 5-step framework that you can see on the screen, but that is fully aligned with the ACTD framework of Business for Nature. It's basically the same thing. What I wanted to mention is that the early steps of our process are what can help companies to assess and prioritize their impacts, taking an angle of societal materiality and focusing on the main indicators of the impacts that companies have on nature. Our guidance is built on existing tools and models, so that's important, that can provide information of, for example, where along the value chain will nature be most at risk of issues such as the extinction of species. And they can also help companies quantify what their operations mean in terms of pressures on the environment. We have also developed guidance, so this is along the third step of our framework, the commit step for business for nature, that can help companies set quantitative and science-based targets on issues such as water quantity and water quality. So with our methods, for example, a company can determine exactly how much reductions they would need to achieve on their water extractions to maintain adequate environmental water flows. And they can also define the exact reductions that they would need to have on their nutrient loading to maintain adequate water quality levels. So these are two examples, but we are also developing methods and guidance to help companies focus on their pressures on terrestrial ecosystems. And there we will focus on issues such as land conversion and land degradation. Having a numerical target on a global goal for nature, such as target 15 of the CBD, would be very helpful for our mission. It can provide us with a very clear anchor for us to align our targets to. And for any company that is implementing targets, it provides a very strong societal mandate to take meaningful actions. The final thing I wanted to mention is that the guidance and the methods that I'm talking about have already been tested by companies in our corporate engagement program. And they're currently under a very extensive review and approval process where we're including feedback from companies, civil society, and sustainability experts. We are releasing all of this guidance for public use in the first quarter of 2023. That's very soon. And at that point, companies will be able to set and validate science-based targets for nature. So steps in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Really excellent to also get a sense of confidence and comfort that the SBTN framework will, it's been tested by companies, that a numerical target in the GBF will provide that clear anchor that everyone can hook to, and that you already are focusing on the actual impacts on the ground, because obviously that's what we need to be focusing on, the pressures on the environment, the fact that we can measure exactly how much the reductions to maintain water flows, the nutrient loading, to make sure that we're maintaining water quality. So this is giving really fantastic support. It's a foundational piece that is being driven also by business with business. So thank you so much, Oscar. And now let's hear from Renata Polini, who is the head of nature at Holcim, the largest cement producer in the world. Now, Renata, thank you so much for being with us today. In Holcim's Nature Positive Strategy by 2030 that you recently published, the company has committed to have a measurable positive impact on biodiversity. So please, can you tell us, how do you plan to measure that? Over to you.
Thank you, Eva. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So first of all, I would like to mention that Holcim supports fully the recommendations made by Business for Nature on the Target 15. So as Eva mentioned, we launched our new nature strategy in September last year, committing to a measurable positive impact on biodiversity. But how are we measuring the progress towards these targets? We are measuring the progress by applying in all our queries a scientific methodology called BIRS, Biodiversity Indicator and Reporting System. This methodology was developed in partnership with the NGO IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that I think all of you guys know. So if I go to the methodology in a nutshell, it's much more complex than that, but it's also very practical to the business. So in a nutshell, the methodology has 3 steps. First one is the quantity. Here we measure the extent of every habitat we have in a site. The second step is the quality. Here for every habitat in a site, we assess the current ecological condition and also the biodiversity suitability. And the third step is the importance. Here we are measuring the uniqueness of every habitat, if there is any endemic species or something that's very, very local for this specific habitat and we need to protect. So at the end of the exercise, we have for every habitat a biodiversity score that can be aggregated to a site final biodiversity index. So this methodology is very good because it allows aggregation. So every habitat has a value and then you can aggregate to a site biodiversity index. Now, if you look at our timeline at the bottom of this slide, you see that we launched our strategy in 2021 and we will establish our biodiversity baseline by 2024, applying the BIRS in all our queries. And then by 2030, we will measure again with the same methodology and our biodiversity index should have a higher value for us to conclude we are moving towards a positive state of biodiversity. At the moment, we have accessed 35% of our land. So we still have a long way to go, but countries are committed to deliver this target. So we are very optimistic that we are going to reach the 2024 milestones and also the biodiversity positive state by 2030. Thanks, Eva.
Thank you so much, Renata. So a practical methodology. And I think also, I mean, if you think about the hundreds of sites that this is going to be applied to, ambitious, but yet also something that you didn't have a chance to talk about is the employee engagement and enthusiasm in terms of engaging with the BIRS methodology. But it is possible, thank you, even in complex companies and such as Holcim. So thank you so much. And finally, I'd like to turn to Sharon Brooks, who is the Principal Business and Biodiversity Specialist at UNEP WCMC and has a tremendous experience and expertise on the subject. So Sharon, no pressure. Very welcome. Thank you for joining. Sharon, can you please explain to us how governments can measure a target to reduce negative impacts by 50%. Over to you, Sharon. Thank you.
Thanks, Eva. I will do my best. It's a pleasure to be here today. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to speak, as Eva mentioned, a little bit about what governments can do. We've already heard an awful lot around the need for alignment in how impacts and indeed dependencies, and I'm going to speak more about impacts at the moment, are measured. And this, in fact, is really key for enabling governments to measure the progress being made by businesses against Target 15. As Eva's pointed out, the ambition of this target is important for both businesses and governments to take the right actions and put the right policies in place. And therefore, UNEP WCMC is very, very supportive of Business for Nature's position on this, as we see this is critical to drive the change that we need. So for governments to measure business progress against this target requires mechanisms at that national level, but which are largely absent at the moment in terms of being able to get this information. But we believe it can be enabled through some key efforts. So if we start with the top left-hand side of the diagram, which is what we've been talking a lot about already, is about how businesses assess their impacts and dependencies. What are the specific metrics that they use to understand their pressures and indeed the change in the state of biodiversity as a result of those pressures in the locations that they're operating? So what we need, as we've mentioned, is this alignment in how businesses are making these assessments, and which, if we move to the next, if we go clockwise around the diagram, this is really, there's a real opportunity here. I'm going to speak about three key opportunities. The first is what we've heard a lot about already, which is around the business and reporting and disclosure. So these frameworks that we've heard about, the Tnfd, and indeed the many other acronyms, as Nadine pointed out at the start, in terms of the Global Reporting Initiative, the ISSB, etc., driving and working together to have more standardized asks of business. What are the requirements that are being set by business? And indeed, as mandatory requirements evolve, this will really further this. We've got the European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive coming out, and trying to work on standardizing the metrics that are being used by businesses, and what governments are then asking businesses to report against can really drive this standardization. So the second point, of course, we of course know the need for standardizing across businesses, but I think another key element is, of course, that reporting that's happening nationally how governments are reporting the impacts and the pressures on biodiversity within their jurisdiction, and indeed within those impacts that are embodied within trade. So alignment also between how businesses are reporting on operations and supply chains and how countries are reporting on the impacts that are happening as a result. So this can be really facilitated. This could really help facilitate the ability of governments to understand what are the contributions that are being made by businesses against our national targets, and how can the national indicators that we're developing support how businesses are reporting. So we've got that ability to be able to see that contribution being made. And this can be really facilitated through those national assessments, national accounts that are being developed at country level. Now, the fourth one, if we go to the next quadrant, in the blue quadrant of this diagram, is around the biodiversity data. So these national assessments that are being carried out in the national ecosystem accounts that are being developed are really important for providing that information on the state of biodiversity. So that underpinning that is used for businesses to understand the impact. So we know that businesses often, they may be on top of what are the pressures that they're having, but what is the state of biodiversity? What are those biodiversity metrics that are needed on ecosystems, on species, and what are the data that are underpinning them for those assessments to be made? So those are the three things that I think governments can do, just to sort of recap, is around standardizing those requirements, aligning with national assessments, and then providing the data into those. But of course, on top of that, we still need that mechanism in place to be able to collate that information and understand the progress being made. Thank you, Eva.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Really helpful framing there. And I'm sure those on the line that are thinking about the implementation phase of the Global Biodiversity Framework in their national context, coming up with the NBSAPs and how a company is going to engage with that and make sure the information is shared in a standardized way, is also critical to what you were describing there. So thank you so much, Sharon. And now we're going to close this webinar already. This is your last chance to jump in right now with any questions or comments. Please feel free to do so. Or of course, you can also get in touch with us and the speakers afterwards if you prefer. But to wrap up, I would say science is clear that we need to reverse biodiversity loss and achieve a nature positive world by 2030. And we cannot question the fact that businesses have a critical responsibility to achieve this objective. The companies you've heard from today clearly embody that responsibility as well. Last year in 2021, Earth Overshoot Day happened on the 29th of July. That's the day that humanity had used up all the biological resources that the Earth regenerates during the entire year. So that means that as humanity, we are currently using 74% more than what the planet's ecosystems can regenerate. So we use 1.7 Earths per year. Clearly not sustainable. And now there is strong scientific basis to justify that business needs to act now to reduce by at least half its negative impacts and to increase the positive impact to contribute to a nature positive world. Now, before I hand over to our final closing speaker, I just want to reflect on just this webinar. We've never had so much momentum in the business community on nature. We have CEOs on stage calling for that policy ambition. We have companies around the world that are fully aware of the importance of a strong global biodiversity framework. We have companies ready to implement the framework, even though it's still being negotiated. And we have companies like the ones on the line today who are ready and want to engage with you as negotiators to make sure that the framework is as transformative, as actionable, and as impactful as possible. So we're really delighted to be at this stage. There is still more work to do, but now I will hand over to our the last word to Charmaine Love from Natura & Co, which is the Brazilian cosmetic company that owns brands like Body Shop and Aesop, to conclude and tell us, what are we hoping to see in the final negotiation meetings in Nairobi at the end of June? Over to you, Charmaine.
Well, thank you so much. What a power hour of amazing insight and energy and urgency from the speakers who've gathered here today. So just to say a giant shout out of thank you. I feel like I've taken pages of notes, and I'm feeling that electricity that comes when we know this is a time to take action. Now, this is absolutely complex, but I think it's really important. It's actually critical not to let this complexity impact the level of ambition, because as we've heard today from all the speakers, we know that this is the right thing to do. And an acceleration will only happen if the CBD shows leadership. Now, I am naturally a hopeful person by nature. I believe in this concept of heliotropy, that when you see a sun, you grow towards it, just as we see plants do the same. We as humans, I think, are not that different than plants. I think we grow taller and stronger and faster when we are motivated by a vision of something that is clear and that is possible. And as we see right now, there is momentum. Eva, you've just sort of, in your closing remarks, really signaled all the different places where that momentum is coming from. But I'm also clear that we do not have time to waste. We can't wait another 10 years just because things seem a little bit unclear. We need to move forward, and we need to move forward fast. And I think it's important for us to look and learn from what we've seen happen in the climate space, because we weren't sure what to do or how to implement a 1.5 degree objective when it was first adopted. But just look in the world right now at the energy and the action that's being mobilized around the world around this target. And I think it's the same thing here. A clear, ambitious, an actionable target will provide a crucial signal to businesses that this is a moment to transform. Now, this is a time to be moved by what we know is needed. Science is telling us what is needed. Actually, science is screaming at what is needed. We don't have the luxury of time to be limited in our ambition and our action, because this is the moment for leadership, and it's actually a moment for your leadership. So if you show ambition, business will act and businesses will support. So thank you very much, Eva. Back to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all. We look forward to continuing this conversation. We're here to help. Please do get in touch. And thank you so much again to all our speakers. Bye, everyone.